What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I am Adam Coffey. You can check him out at chairmangroup.us or one of his main websites, Adam E. Coffey, Coffey.com. And Adam, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Since this is part of the private equity series, one of the ones Keith Burns I had, and he talks about strategic business acquisitions, which Adam talks a lot about in his several books. So we'll kind of chat about that. Also, Vivian Gonzalez talks about hiring and executive search and some of the executive search she does for these private equity-backed companies. And Adam talks a lot about culture and how important culture and team members are in his work as well. And then Alice Chen talks about overlooked investment opportunities. So check some of those out on InspiredInsider.com. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. We do that in a few ways. One, we're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, accountability, and the full execution production. We're also an easy button for a company's corporate gifting. So we make gifting and staying top of mind for clients. It could be partners, prospects, even staff from a culture perspective, easy and affordable. You just give us a list of the people, we do everything else. And Adam, it's not like a once a year type of gift. It's like we like to send a campaign of gifts. So think 3 to 4 gifts a year for 4 to 5 years. Okay. So for me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways on how I can give to my best relationships. I found no better way to profile the people and companies I most admire on the podcast and share with the world what they're working on. And 2, sending them sweet treats in the mail. So go to rise25.com or email support@rise25.com. I'm super excited to introduce Adam. Adam Coffey, he has over 25 years of experience as CEO. He's built 4 companies for 9 private equity firms. During the time period, he completed 58 acquisitions. His track record includes notable outcomes measured in the billions with a B. And he shared his knowledge really generously through his books, which I have listen to all of them, actually. So the Private Equity Playbook, you can check it out. The Exit Strategy Playbook. The Private Equity Playbook has 2 editions, and Empire Builder. So thank you, Adam, for joining me.
Good to be here. Nice to meet you in person, or in the digital world, if you will. And hello to all your listeners out there. I'm ready. Let's do this.
Let's do it. So we'll get into some of the examples. One of the things I was curious about after listening to your books is why the military? We're looking at a picture behind you there, but why the military to start your journey?
Yeah, it's a good question, and so pretty simple answer, really. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. Those were kind of my younger years. Graduated from high school in 82. And my street, everybody who lived on that street, their dads either served in World War II or Korea. My dad was a Navy guy, who served in the Korean War. And so patriotism, apple pie, Chevrolet, was
this is you right
display.
Here, right, Adam?
Yeah,
that's
the Army.
On the Adam Coffey page.
Yeah. So my
story.
dad,
Look at this.
my dad was a Navy guy, which is why I'm an Army guy. Right. So it's like, don't do what your dad does, do something else. But my dad instilled a strong work ethic in me. I remember, as I was approaching the age to drive, and I grew up in a fairly affluent family, and it's like, you want a car? I'm not buying you a car. What are you going to do, for a car? I had to go out and get a job. It's like, comes time for college. Well, what are you going to do? I went Navy ROTC to Notre Dame. It's like, well, I'm going to go Army then, and there was just always this desire, kind of built in from an early age, to be patriotic, to want to serve. The movies I watched growing up, the TV shows were all glorifying World War II and, things like that. So grew up a patriotic kid. If you saw me at 12 or 13, I'm running around in the woods wearing fatigues and a BB gun. I belong to the NRA. It's like we're playing war games, out in the woods. And it's like, so it was just always kind of preordained. I always knew as a young teenager that I was going to go into the service right out of high school.
What was a memorable story for you in the military?
Well, it was during the Cold War, so it was a different time and era. Ronald Reagan was my commander in chief, and I'd say, Ronald Reagan inspired a generation. Same way Barack Obama did, he inspired a generation selling hope. Ronald Reagan sold patriotism, and that was at the height of the Cold War and, the fall of the Berlin Wall and, the collapse of what was the former Soviet Union. So it was a very interesting time, in American history. And, I remember one time, so I was competing, actually, I was going for my sergeant stripe and I was actually Soldier of the Year. So, I went through a promotion board. Someone said, "Hey, this kid looks great. Send him to the Soldier of the Month competition." And I just kept going to competitions, and I literally never lost. I just kept going, up.
What were the competitions? Like, what do you have to do?
Oh, well, it'd be multiple soldiers coming from multiple commands. There would be, military history. It's almost like, a sweepstakes for, but it includes physical things. It includes, uniform inspections, your records, your knowledge. It's quite a competition. And so I literally met everybody in my chain of command, but I'll never forget that I was invited to speak at the 2nd Armored Division World War II reunion. And here I am as this young, 18, 19, 20-year-old, and I'm giving a speech to literally all of the people who fought under George Patton, General Patton, and, they created the history that I was studying, and it was a very moving, humbling experience. And of course, they all made me their mascot, and fed me alcohol in massive quantities at night at the bar, But it was fun. It was a fun time, So for me, the military was I learned about discipline, teamwork, leadership. Without those base skills, as an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, I never hit CEO. And I also, because I started as an enlisted guy, right out of high school, I started at the bottom. I was a private E1. And there is no lower form of life in the military than a private E1 in the United States Army, other than maybe a second lieutenant, and I say that jokingly. I looked up and I saw bubble gum on the bottom of somebody else's shoe. That's how low I started. But it informed my thinking, as I became a non-commissioned officer, an NCO, I was a servant leader, protect my squad, protect my troops, and lead from the front. And as I worked my way up an org chart, I literally held every job a guy could hold on an organizational chart, from truck driver to CEO. And I never forgot, those lessons of servant leadership learned in the service, and the fact that I was, blue collar guy, and non-commissioned officer working your way up. I always valued my employees and the people in the trenches because I used to be one. And so I'd say you tie all that together and it informs my thinking today. I'm a servant leader. I take care of people. I care, genuinely care about people when I'm running a business or I've got thousands of employees. I care about their lives. I care about their futures. I want to be a good steward to them. Same time, though, I have to make money for shareholders. So I'm also a good steward to shareholders and recognize that in order for me to make the magic work, I have to do both at the same time. I have to build a strong culture, take care of people, be a good servant leader, articulate the vision, inspire people to want to achieve more. And I have to make shareholders a ton of money. And that's the magic, I think, of my career. And it started at age 17, literally right out of high school in boot camp for my 18th birthday, in the U.S. Army.
You went on to GE, and I love to hear some advice you got from mentors at GE. I remember you saying there was one person, I think he used to play for the Cleveland Browns, and
Yes,
you were
Mike
thinking
Brown.
thinking of leaving, and he talked about you being
Yeah, so it was
president. Can you
Mike
talk about
Martin. Mike
that?
Martin was his name. He played for the Cleveland Browns, and he was a professional football player, but he had some injury problems. If I remember, it was knees. But at any rate, very inspiring leader. Went on to be an executive at GE, and then later on became a CEO. And he was my mentor. And I literally was within days of leaving GE. I was an engineer. And I was really doing well, making a ton of money as a 21, 22, 23-year old. I was making a ton of money. And at some point, I had written a business plan. I was about ready to quit, take off, and I got called to the principal's office. So, get on an airplane, fly from Detroit, come over to Cincinnati is where our little headquarters was for our piece of the empire. And, he's like, hey, he was a new GM coming in. He was going through his personnel files. He was looking at what GE calls the code one performers, the top couple of percent of employees, that really made an impact in business. And so he took me under his wing and he threw me off to GE Crotonville, which was GE's, college campus, and the John F. Welsh Leadership Academy, which they just recently closed, which was pretty amazing. But at any rate, back then, the world's business leaders, the top, the best. You remember, GE's number one, Fortune 500 list. Jack's the world's most admired CEO. GE's top talent, the Code One performers. They're being developed. They're being groomed. They're being promoted quickly. They're learning, they're learning how to run different types of businesses. Back then, Crotonville, the courses were taught by business leaders, not by a cadre of professional, teachers, but by the business leaders coming in, every day and teaching people how to run a company, a global business. So that's where I learned how to run a business. And so I was at the crossroad in my career and I decided, do I go off and be the entrepreneur? Do I stay at GE and become, and compete against every Harvard MBA, that's out there? And I decided to stay at GE, and I'm super glad I did. I'm sure I would have been successful if I'd have gone the other path, but not to the same degree or same level. So GE taught me how to run a business at the time before tech existed, when Jack's the world's most admired, CEO. GE's number one on the Fortune 500 list. It's doubling in size every 3 years. It was a magical time to learn how to run a company. And then those skills parlayed into the 25 years in the 4 companies I built after.
Do you remember, Adam, what was that original business plan? Like what business at that point
I
were
still
you
have
thinking?
it.
What were
I
you thinking
still
of
have it.
starting?
It's in a
Yeah.
box in my garage, and periodically, Jeremy, I'll just like take the thing out and I'll look at it and it's like, would this have been
What
successful?
was it? What was the business?
Well, I don't mind telling you. So back at the time, this is in the early infancy days of home inspections. I had a good friend who was a real estate broker. He sold 800 homes a year. Well, 400 of those would get inspected. 800 of them would get appraised. And so I was an engineer. I went and got my builder's license, became a licensed general contractor in 1995. I still hold that license. I just did my continuing education just this past week, to renew my license for like the 30th year. And, I never let a license expire. I hold every license I've ever gotten in my life, even if I haven't used it in 20 plus years. So at any rate, I was going to start a home inspection company. He was going to be a partner. I was going to get GE engineers. We were on call working, weird hours for hospitals, but we also had a lot of downtime, kind of like a firefighter. You would be on, be off, kind of like a nurse, on and off. And so I was getting a bunch of GE engineers to get their builder's license. That was going to be my angle. There were no credentials back then. So every inspector was going to be a licensed, going to be an engineer and a licensed, professional builder. And that was the road. I had it all laid out. I'm sure I would have built a multi-million-dollar business early in the days of the home inspection industry really taking off. Maybe it would have become a franchise. Who knows? But I left that to learn how to be, a professional manager in the Fortune number one company run by the world's most admired CEO. And I'm glad I did. Obviously it was the right choice. But it was Mike Martin, the former Cleveland Brown player, who inspired me to stay. He didn't know I was going to leave.
Oh, you didn't know?
He didn't know I was going to leave. at the time, I mean, he was just meeting his top performers and trying to figure out how to better utilize them in a business that he just took over. And so I became a protege of his.
So after GE in the private equity world, what was uh, maybe a first major milestone for you?
Well, when I got recruited by private equity, this is back when we had phones on our desks, not on our walls, and we didn't walk around with something in front of our face, and so I, was recruited, and I used to kid, but I honestly think there's some truth to it. When people were graduating through Crotonville, I bet there was a janitor who got the name off of every door because they had, the facility where you stayed was a part of the college, and they probably took all the names down and sold that list to somebody because magically, as soon as you got
That was
done
the
with,
janitor's side hustle.
yeah, it was. But as soon as you got done, with a major Crotonville type course, all of a sudden your phone starts ringing. Recruiters are trying to pick you off because the entire world wants GE's top talent. Who's at Crotonville? The top 5%. And the people that GE wants to invest time and money in. And so I remember going to Mike, my mentor, who was not at GE at the time. He had left to go be president of a company, but kind of like YPO, your group, your mentor group never really falls apart. It's together forever for life. And so I went to him. Hey, Mike, it's like I'm one of 1,000 general managers at GE, or go be a president and CEO for the first time in a smaller company. And I remember his words of advice, Adam, once a president, always a president. Go be a president. GE will never appreciate you as a president till you go be one somewhere else. And amazingly enough, when Jack left, a lot of the GE leaders left and they went on to run other companies. Bob Nardelli went to Home Depot and John Tranny went to run Stanley. And so people were landing in other places. And they were calling ex-GE folks and like, hey, Adam, I got a service company, that I'm building that, would love to have you, come and run. Because once I went and became a president, no one saw me as any other role other than president. And that held true the rest of my career. So I think, a lot of good lessons learned, a lot of great times. I could tell you stories, that are like, just Charlie Sheen, type stories in the movie, Wall Street, with Michael Douglas. It's like all kinds of just, great stories from back in that era. But it was a great place to learn how to run a company. So military taught me how to take care of people, how to lead. GE taught me how to run a business. You put those two experiences together and then set me off in a bunch of PE-backed adventures. I didn't know what private equity was when my phone rang and I got recruited for the first time. I was just chasing title and money. And I didn't even, think about stock and ownership in companies could be a wealth generator for me. I kind of discounted the long-term incentive equity until I got paid the first time. But, but that was, it was, I learned about PE pretty much like everybody else has, which is I stumbled into it and I got into the ecosystem and then I learned by stepping in potholes and, and constantly learning.
What are some of those potholes that even you stepped in early on?
Well, so I would say when you're young and you're a rising star or a founder, who's found some success, I call it the accidental arrogance of success. You think you're God's gift to everything. You think no one in the world can teach you anything because by God, I built a company, or by God, I'm an ex-GE, code one, rising star. Nobody can teach me anything, And so I think humility is probably one of the first big lessons of an entrepreneur or founder selling a business and partnering, with a PE sponsor. Hey, this is the world's most sophisticated asset class that's gone from hundreds of billions of dollars when I first started working with them to over $7 trillion, today, and to a industry that was nascent to an industry that now buys 50% of all companies bought and sold on the planet. I mean, so the growth has been spectacular. And I learned somewhere along the way that humility and being collaborative with, the folks and the people and the operating partners and learning how to work in a different kind of an environment. At GE, it's not that we weren't team players because we all built teams, but we were also very competitive. And, you're seeking to stay on top, be that code one performer, crush it. And it's like, that's you and your team. It's not you and your team collaborating with other teams, and so it was business as a professional sport, sometimes in the heyday of GE, I think. So humility was the first big lesson. And then, win as a team, lose as a team. There's some merit to that. The world can throw you curveballs. I was a CEO when planes flew into buildings during the Great Recession, during the pandemic. And you know what? When there's trouble, in the world of PE, you need to communicate, a lot, but you need to communicate not just good. You need to be Johnny on the spot with, hey, my crystal ball says we're in trouble. This pandemic hit, we're going to get slammed, in 6 months. Looks pretty good right now, but I can already tell from my metrics, that we're going to get slammed. I learned how to be data driven at GE, so that wasn't a big stretch for me. A lot of entrepreneurs are CEO whisperers. They're like reading the tea leaves. They're like, I think it's Bill Paxton in the movie Twister. He bends down and he gets a handful of dirt and it's running through his fingers and he's like, there's the tornadoes, go that way. And it's like a lot of entrepreneurs are cowboys. They're not team players. They also want to win, but they want to win as a solopreneur, it's their victory, not their team's victory, And so I'd say there's a lot of early lessons that up and coming executives learn, and they all relate to humility.
Adam, you mentioned the pandemic and recession, and I know one of the reasons you updated the private equity playbook is because a lot happened since you published the first one. So what's different in the second one? What do you have to include in the second edition? I'll pull it up here so people can see. They can also check it out on anywhere you buy books, Audible, Amazon.
Well,
what was different?
So the private equity playbook, that first edition, which still hits number one on the charts all the time, and pretty much has never really left the top 10 in some version format, on Amazon. And I researched it in 2017, wrote it in 2018, came out in January or February of 2019. And at the time, I remember, one number in particular, at the time of the research, private equity was at 2.83 trillion in assets under management. 5 short years later, over 7 trillion in assets under management. I think in the second edition, I quote 6. But it's over 7 today. So it's like the asset class has grown tremendously. The volume of activity in companies bought has doubled, in that same 5-year period. Because of enhanced competition, there's more and more companies being bought and more industries being permeated by private equity than there were 5 years ago. And so some of the plays have been, I'll call it, reimagined just simply because of this growth. Companies generally are trading for slightly higher multiples than historical averages, but at the same time, you've got interest rates have gone up, and so how private equity acts and makes money is come under a lot of pressure in recent years, and so I just felt that I needed to go back through that book. It was my first book, the first one, and it still sells better than the second edition, but I actually like the second edition much better. It contains the first edition, but there's probably 20+% more content in that second book. And so, I felt the need to go back and redo it. And of course, I shot myself in the foot by doing it, and I saw it coming. I told my publisher, it's like, if I put out the second edition, I can't retire the first edition because outlets like Amazon won't take the thousands of star ratings and associate it from the old book to the new book because the content changes. It's a different ISBN. So they have to both coexist. And I said, here's what's going to happen. The first book is going to fall from being number one permanently because the second edition is going to siphon some volume off. And so now you routinely find both editions in the top 10 but neither one of them number one. On occasion, the first edition still hits number one. But when people are buying both editions, it's like my volume is being, constantly coming under pressure. And so, I saw it coming. I knew that would happen, but I can't pull one because I can't associate that volume. It's not just, a second printing. It's a true different edition. There's a lot of similarity to it, but there is like 25% different content. So it has to be done the way it's done. But really what I saw coming, to be honest with you, is just entrepreneurs, even to this day, still don't know what the heck private equity is or how it works and how it functions. If I teach a seminar today, you put 1,000 business owners in a room and I give them a 10-question multiple choice basic quiz on private equity, 90% of the room fails it. I know, I've done it. It's like they just fail. We've heard the term. We see bad news stories on TV. We hear the hero stories. I sold my company for 20 times. Well, that's because you had no earnings, and 20 times nothing is still nothing, right? But it's like all these hero stories, all these, social media, the news always puts out bad stories, about private equity. I'm God's gift to business. I built a $10 million company. No private equity weenie is going to tell me how to do something better. It's like there's people out there, God bless them, who have sold companies for, relatively small numbers. And I collect them at that size, put them together, and I build giant empires. And it's like, you can learn, you can constantly be learning from people. And so I think there's tons of opportunity, but I think PE as an asset class is still highly misunderstood. Only now, because it's even more prevalent than it was 5-6 years ago, it's more important for business owners to understand what it is and how it works, even if they don't plan to sell to it. PE has created the market that lets you build a company and sell it to somebody and make a ton of money. And so we need to understand it. And I tell people, we are tools. I'm an operator. I'm a founder. I'm a builder. PE is a tool that helps me accelerate growth and generate wealth for my family, and my employees. But for them, they're capital looking for a tool. I'm their tool. I have to be the right tool for the job. I have to fit the profile of what they're trying to accomplish, but it's a relationship that, when properly aligned, works really, really well. Is it easy? No. Are the stats pretty rough? Yeah. 73% of all transitioning founders don't survive the first 5-year hold period in private equity. And there's a number of reasons why that is, but one of the big ones is they're completely unprepared to play business as a professional sport at the highest level. And they just made a bunch of money, and they don't want to be told what to do, and they don't want to work hard anymore. And I'm God's gift, and I read the dirt, in my hand, and it's like, and PE's data driven, and and is looking for you to develop a crystal ball based on numbers and to work harder than you've ever worked before. And so that's why I call it business as a professional sport. It's played at the highest level. It's intense. It ages you in dog years. But when it works, it's magical.
What are the other reasons, Adam, people don't stay?
So 73% fail. Some portion was elderly. They were in their 60s, 70s, and they were just looking to get out. So there's a portion of that population that includes those people who plan to exit. And then there's a portion of people who just made a bunch of money and they get lazy. And then there's a portion of people who don't play well with others, who don't, they're that lone wolf that doesn't take well to team, the concept of team, business as a team sport. There's a lot of people who never had accountability before in their lives. They spent decades, building a business. And if they didn't do well, they didn't care. They did well enough, for this year. And then they went back at it next year. In the world of PE, you got a boss. You got a board of directors. You've got other people. You might, I'm on the board of several companies today. You got people like me, going in and telling you what I think about how you run your business, or how I think that we might attack growth differently. And so it's like some people just can't play team sport. They're a lone wolf. And some people do make that transition and they stay and they thrive. And then other people are willing to make the transition, but they just don't perform. the business doesn't perform at the next level. Part of what I teach, especially in books like Empire Builder, is how to play at that level before you actually become that level. So learn how to be, think, and act. And by the way, you'll accelerate growth tremendously. Learn how to be a private equity backed portfolio company before you actually sell and become one. And so my focus now at my age, I made a ton of money. So I'm less driven by the monetary side, more driven by, hey, I want to help people. I want to help you beat the odds. I want to help you succeed. I want to help you succeed at a higher level. That's why I write books. I donate my royalties to charity. I don't even keep my royalties. They're 6 figures a year, and I donate them, to charity. I'm here to help people succeed. Do I get paid for coaching and mentoring? Of course I do. I'm not free. I'm not a charity. I do give to charity, but this is how I generate my cash flow. I joke with people and say, if I was homeless, standing on a corner, my cardboard sign would say "works for jet fuel." I have an expensive lifestyle and I work to generate cash flow. I don't live off a portfolio. I'm not a trust fund baby of my own, and I'm not going to be dependent on one for, until I got a drool bucket, so I'm, I work, I get paid because my time's valuable, but at the same time, my true goal and objective is help people succeed.
What's Adam, key advice you've given some of these companies when you've been on the board? Do you remember anything in particular that, you know, I'm sure people give advice and not everyone listens to the advice or executes on that advice, but one where you gave some advice and they actually listened and executed on it?
So I see it all the time because remember, I work with PE still today, and I work with founders. So I'm working with about 71 founder-led companies right now. And I work with them in different ways, different levels. Some are in a cohort, a peer group. Others I work one-to-one. And I was just telling a large independently owned company yesterday. I just joined, at the board level. They're paying me a lot of money, and they're big, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and they're sizable in earnings, and they're giant, and they're still privately held, which is rare. And I was explaining to them, as I explained to many, look, there's 3 things that I do. I teach, I help you plan, and then I ride shotgun on tactical execution. A lot of founders, because of that arrogance, don't want to learn. They don't think there's anything to learn. And I was telling these guys, very successful people, they're all worth 9 figures, the primary shareholders. And I was telling them my best outcomes happen when leadership teams, founders and their teams learn the tools. They go back to my boot camp for a couple of days, and learn all the different ways that you run a company, grow a company. I've developed this toolkit that I've used in multiple industries, multiple companies, success every time, billions in exits. I can teach you something. You just have to have an open mind. I'll never be an expert in their industry. I don't have to be. I'm an expert in troubleshooting, growing, scaling, M&A, exiting. So we take their knowledge plus my tools, and then we craft the vision, the strategy for the future. When people do that, my outcomes are just infinitely better than when they don't. I've had founders with about 500 million in exits just in the past 18 to 24 months. And so, the people I'm working with are building to scale, building to get to an exit, positioning for private equity ownership. And when they listen to advice, good things happen. We were talking off mic about one of the first companies I started working with after I peeled out of the CEO seat and said, I'm done being a CEO, hang up my cleats. I want to help people. I want to teach. I want to write. I want to get on stages. I want to explain to people how business works, give back, to the next generation of business leaders. And, in the first company I started working with, small, under 2 million in earnings at the time, if I'm remembering correctly.
This is the IT company.
Yeah. Three short years later, 12 million. Top flight investment bank now taking them out to market. Sell this year for 150 plus million. Matter of fact, they could be 15 million by the time we actually get to market. Could be 225 million. Here's a guy in a company that was worth about 15 million when I started working with him. 3 years later, they're worth mid nine figure, 150 to 225, depending on where we go to market. And, it's that this kind of wealth creation is possible. You have to believe in it, and you have to be willing to just make a small investment in learning how to play this kind of a game. And when you take the time to actually go through the steps, the 3 steps, learn, plan, execute. When you go through that, then great things happen, and they happen much quicker than people ever dreamed, that they could happen. So in this case, it was a buy and build. We started buying other companies, putting them together, growing organically, investing in systems and processes, doing all of that other stuff that we needed to do, growing organically. But M&A was the growth accelerator. That was the real playbook. And, arbitrage and multiple expansion, is the levers that we're pulling to make it happen. Learning how to do M&A, well, I've been doing it for decades, so I teach people how to use M&A as a growth accelerator. They were willing to learn. They were a great leadership team. They were open to new ideas. They embraced them and they executed. And the end result is they're, 6 times the size in 3 years. You look at my last company that I ran. It was bought for around 125 million, round numbers. 50% debt, 50% equity. PE sponsor, PE bought it. And I come in to run it. I buy 8 companies. And 3 years later, we sold that company for 550 million. The 8 companies we bought, not a penny of equity was required, 100% debt. So other than writing the first check for 62 million, the half, the original purchase price, everything else we did in 3 years was debt. The cash flow in the companies we bought put together, and the turnaround and the organic growth and the things that we were doing in that time period fueled and serviced the debt until the exit. And then we sold it for 550 in cash, a 4x multiple of invested capital in 3 years. And, it was 27 months for me. But they, that's a 50+% IRR. And, it's like, it does not take long to find success when you know what the levers are and how to pull them, and how to adjust them for different industries. You can do, great things and accomplish great things in a very short period of time. And so what I do when I'm working with founders today, I just teach people how to do it on a smaller level. It's not quite the magnitude, but the results are the same. So a guy goes from 15 million to 150 million in value, 10 times the value in 3 years, where I went from 60 to 550, or 125 to 550 in 3 years. When I've got institutional capital, I can buy bigger things. I can buy more of them. I can slam it together. I don't have to worry about how to manage a capital stack. When I'm a small company, I got to navigate SBA. I got to navigate commercial loans. I got to potentially find some investors. It's harder. It's harder when I'm smaller, but I'm buying smaller stuff. And I can do the same magnitude of return or better. I'm just playing it at a slightly smaller level. And so, the concepts of arbitrage and multiple expansion work. And they work whether you're small or you're big. And so, the tools, again, are the same. People who embrace them and execute get good outcomes. People who already know everything there is to know, they get mediocre outcomes.
So, Adam, in the MSP, the IT example, can you talk about some of the examples? You mentioned the toolkit, some examples of the tools they use to grow.
So I've helped multiple MSPs build and exit, over the last few years. And, when I think of any company, doesn't have to be an MSP. If I want to grow a business, so first of all, there's 3 things I want to do when I'm building a company. I want to grow top line revenue. I want to improve margins, and I want to use mergers and acquisition to accelerate growth and to harness multiple expansion and arbitrage so that what I ultimately sells for a higher multiple, and I get the difference between the low multiple I pay for a small company and the large multiple I get when I sell a bigger company. So those are the 3 things I want to do. Well, I don't care what industry, what company. If I'm going to grow top line revenue, I go to the same levers every time: price, volume, pivot, tiering. Those are the 4 ways I drive top line organic growth. Price. most underutilized lever there is. If I'm a company with a 10%, EBITDA margin or 10% profit margin, and I have a 30% gross profit, and I'm at 20% or less SG&A or back office expense. If I raise price 5% and maintain volume, then I've increased profits by 50%. That nickel, that extra nickel just falls all the way to the bottom, and I go from a 10% profitability company to 15 by just raising price 5%. Well, in the last 5 years, if you check the government statistics, inflation is averaged about 22%, but they're lying to us. It's 22% over 5 years, but they don't include energy or food. The two things that have gone up the most. Now Trump has come back and energy's come back down, but if you take those two components, if you look at true inflation, it's been over 30% in the last 5 or 6 years. So how many companies out there have raised their prices 30%? I get letters every week, from it's, hey, Adam, Netflix, thank you, we love you, and we're raising your price 30%. Well, I don't care. They could double my price, and I'm still going to keep Netflix. Shh, don't tell them. But it's so price, volume, pivot, tiering. What's a pivot? Volume, we all know, sell more. Price, get more for what you're selling. What about pivot? Well, I've got customers. What else can I sell them? And making strategic pivots sets up cross sells. So if I've got a new thing, I can sell that to my old customers. And if I bought a company that does something different, I can go to all their customers and sell them my old core products. And so I love setting up cross sells by making strategic pivots, by widening the products and services that my core company I started with is actually selling. One of my most important levers, price and pivot. Tiering, Mercedes-Benz, S-Class, E-Class, C-Class. I buy the S-Class. Once I get in, they have 3 options, to get more wallets into a showroom, virtual or otherwise, to buy a Mercedes. People that got a lot of money buy the S-Class. Well, once I'm an S-Class buyer, I got 3 versions of the S-Class. I can do the S480, 580, or the AMG, and so, learning how to tier products and services, learning how to put out multiple bids rather than one. Your customer wants a new roof. Well, let's give them 3 quotes, good, better, best. Let's show them 3 different ways. Some of my clients will pay more. Other clients will go in the middle. 60% of people go in the middle when they get 3 choices. And some people that buy the low end, they would have said no to me if I only put 1 bid out. But because I've truly cost reduced and given them a C-Class instead of an S-Class Mercedes that cost me less to produce, I can capture that wallet. So price, volume, pivot, tiering. If I want to improve margins, I look for continuous improvement. A lot of companies out there use EOS. That's great. EOS is a good system for continuous improvement. Gino Wickman did a great job. Nobody knows who Gino is because he built such a good system. They don't have to know what who Gino is, right? It's not about him. It's about the system. So, there I'm looking for high volume activity. What do I do the most? And can I incrementally improve the process that drives the outcome? And, if I've got 1,900 service techs doing 1 million service calls, if I can make a service call 5%, 10% more efficient times 1 million iterations, I can really drastically improve. So I look for high volume. And once I find high volume tasks, I try to incrementally improve them. But I also look at what I call high value work, low value work. If I've got a bunch of technicians who are skilled tradesmen, high value work is in front of broken equipment where I can bill a customer. Low value work is driving, chasing parts, filling out paperwork. I want to outsource, automate, or eliminate low value work. And then I've got M&A. I want to grow earnings by 30% a year because that's what I learned how to do under Jack. And if you didn't maintain that kind of growth rate for GE to double in size every 3 years, you weren't going to stay on that rising star promotable kind of category. You had to find a way to hit that number. I never forgot how to hit that number. Same levers from 35 years ago, still apply. So when I look at all of that stuff, price, volume, pivot, tiering, outsource, automate, eliminate, low value work, and attack high volume tasks, at first, then I've got M&A. If I'm not hitting 30% on those first levers, then M&A is the magic that fills the gap. And as I'm growing at 30+% a year in earnings, I'm literally doubling the company every 3 years, just like GE was doing, when I was there in from 1991 to 2001. Every 3 years, stock split, doubled in price. So that's what our goal and objective is. If I can do that organically, well, I don't have to do M&A if I don't want to, because my company's literally going to quadruple in size its earnings in a 5-year period. I'm going to get the arbitrage. But I would tell you, if I have unlimited capital and I can hire a team, why not do both? So if I'm growing at 30% organically with margin improvement and all the organic levers, maybe I can grow by 40 or 50% if I include M&A. So I don't want to limit my success, but my target is minimum 30% growth in earnings every year. If you can do that for 4 years or 5 years, you quadruple the earnings of the company, and your exit's going to be large. And that's what I did with my last company. I went from a value of 125 to 550 in 3 years.
Adam, on that point, I know there were 8 acquisitions in there. And so I'm wondering, some of them, obviously you've been very successful doing that. And there's a lot of mistakes people make on the acquisition front. So I'd love to hear some of the common mistakes there. But I do want to say, if you do check out, I know that the IT MSP company, there's various ways to engage and work with Adam in general. He does consulting, does teaching and speaking, obviously his books, but if you go to chairmangroup.us and you go to the courses page, he's got some programs there that include digital access, but also digital plus group calls and digital plus group plus one-on-one. So, if you are a company and this sounds like this is what you want to be doing, then you can check out this page and contact them there. What were some of the mistakes from an acquisition side that you see people make that you've learned from?
There's 2 good, things I can comment on here real quickly. One of them is not knowing what good looks like before they start looking. I'm going to do acquisitions, but I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't have what I call as a buy box. I haven't determined, so first of all, good M&A starts with strategy. Why am I doing M&A? I'm either extending geographic reach, or I'm creating a strategic pivot, or I'm building density. I'm either getting bigger and I'm expanding where I'm doing business, or I'm adding new capability, or I'm building density in my core business and my core markets. It's like there's very few, strategies out there, but I need to define what my strategies are. And then I have to develop a buy box for each strategy that says, what's the ideal company? What does my perfect acquisition look like? I'm doing multiple roll-ups in the accounting space right now. There's 1.8 million accounting firms in the US. Well, how the hell do I know what good looks like out of 1.8 million unless I've designed it first? Now, when I go looking at companies, I can quickly ascertain whether, hey, this company fits, doesn't fit, go on. People waste too much time by going down rabbit holes looking at companies that aren't the right fit. So they don't put time up front in strategy. They don't put time into determining what good looks like. Another common mistake that I see people make is impatience. M&A is a slow game, even for me. So my last empire, I bought 23 companies in 5 years, but I only bought 1 the first year. And I bought like 3 the second year and like 4 the next year and 7, 8, it's like it accelerates. It's like the pump at grandma's house. It's like you got to work it for a long time before water starts coming out. Here in Texas, wells are 1,200 feet deep. That's a lot of hand pumping before water comes out. But once it comes out, it keeps on coming. And then a quick pump every once in a while keeps that flow going. M&A, same way. So entrepreneurs tend to be impatient. That's the second, fatal flaw. Number 3, another big flaw. They buy fixer-uppers. They're looking for a good deal. Now, I'm a turnaround guy, but I tell you, if you're playing M&A for the first time, and you only buy good companies run by good people. If you think you're creating value by buying a mediocre company that's underperforming and you're going to fix it, you don't understand M&A at all, because the way money is made using M&A is by buying a bunch of good companies, putting them together and getting bigger, and then harnessing multiple arbitrage. So example, the 8 companies I bought, on average price, I paid 5 times. I paid 5x earnings for each of those 8 companies. When I sold it for 14 times earnings. The profit is made naturally. Small companies trade for small multiples because they're plentiful. Large companies trade for larger multiples because they're rare. There's not as many of them. People have to pay more to get them. So if I can get the company to grow bigger, I'm going to get arbitrage. If I get bogged down trying to fix someone else's crap, I waste time that could be directed towards buying more good companies and putting them together. Pay fair market value. That's all I have to do, because as I get bigger, I'm going to get the return. So those are the kind of 3 common mistakes.
Yep.
I don't have a strategy. I don't know what good looks like. And I think I'm going to make money because I'm buying fixer-uppers at a good price. That's not how the game is played. Those are the 3 common mistakes. And patience, that's the 4th. I'm not patient. I want to get a deal done. I have dealitis. I call it shiny penny syndrome. I want to do a deal so bad I overlook obvious flaws, and I do a deal anyway just because I want to do a deal.
Adam, I know you got to run, so I do want to point out people can check out chairmangroup.us to learn more. You could also check out AdamECoffey.com. You can check out his books anywhere they are. Empire Builder, we mentioned, the Exit Strategy Playbook, and the Private Equity Playbook. Adam, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Good luck to all
great.
your listeners out there. Success starts right here. Believe you can. It can happen to you. Good luck.
Love it.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like $100 grand.